Welcome back to Farming Explained, the channel where we talk about agriculture, which increasingly seems to involve talking about a lot of far-right ideology. Let's get into it. Lord Lymington was born in Wyoming to an American mother, but came to England to take his hereditary titles. He spent the 1930s as a Conservative MP, devising a British brand of fascism that aimed essentially to reinstate feudalism, restoring both aristocratic control of politics and the genetic superiority of the British through making everyone peasants again. To make his dreams a reality, Lord Lymington led a series of elite, ultra-conservative organisations, successively the English Mystery, the English Array, Kinship in Husbandry, and after the war he founded the Soil Association, which still exists today, and busies itself with things like sponsoring the Oxford Real Farming Conference. We've talked about these guys before in this video. They even tried to overthrow the government in 1933 by hijacking the Conservative Party from the inside and replacing Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister with a chap called Lord Lloyd, who would be a temporary dictator under whom they would be able to reinstate feudalism. This feudalist political movement, developed in the context of European fascism, was the Organic movement. This ideology drew on the ideas of Nazi Agriculture Minister Richard Walter Darré, who pushed a concept called blood and soil, blot and boden, which is still detailed on the Soil Association's website through this quote from Albert Howard. "The health of soil, plants, animals and man is one and indivisible." At first glance, this sounds reasonable. But we've looked at definitions of fascism before, and fascist ideology is incoherent. It doesn't make sense. Nutrition is important for health, not soil. It would be possible to have a country with perfect agriculture and eat only carbohydrates and be malnourished, just as it would be possible to have soil that will be exhausted imminently by terrible agricultural practices, but eat healthily. Soil and health are linked, perhaps, but they're not indivisible, which is where this ideology goes wrong. People don't talk about Lord Lymington very much, but he is immensely important. He bankrolled loads of far-right organisations and publications, he had loads of very powerful friends, he almost certainly colluded with the Nazis during the war, which we've talked about in a video, and he chaired a lot of important organisations, including the CLA. And his friend Lord Northbourne coined the term organic to describe their ideology in 1941, and that's a word we still use today to describe how people may relate to their environment. Today I wanted to talk about one of the books that Lymington wrote, Alternative to Death, the relationship between soil, family and community. And that's not because I think this is the most significant of the books that he wrote, but because I think it marks a shift. The earlier works published by members of the organic movement were entirely political. They were about people, and they often didn't mention soil at all. By 1943, when this book was published, liking the Nazis wasn't cool anymore. So what we see here is the ultra-conservative British brand of fascism ceased to emphasise the feudal, natural social hierarchies that they wanted to re-establish, and start emphasising natural hierarchies. They start talking about ecology and soil, which is stuff they didn't do before. But because of this shift, it allowed the organisations founded by Lymington and his friends to continue during the war, and after the war, and up to the present day. The reason this book is significant is because it marks the moment that fascism becomes environmentalism. The book starts when the nutritionist Robert McCarrison discovered that rats fed on the equivalent diet of city dwellers grew diseased, nervous, treacherous, quarrelsome and cannibalistic, but that similar rats fed on the fresher, whole, simple diet of some Indian hill tribes were fertile, gentle and healthy, he thumbed a long nose at the last 2 centuries of progress. The problem Lymington sees is that cities exist. Cities are unnatural. They break the bond between blood and soil and corrupt the people in them. Man is bound to the soil. When he enters the city, he cuts himself off from one side of his own cosmic nature, and even his fertility fails, so that he has to be constantly renewed from the country stock. He develops the habits of the parasite, be he lawyer or money changer, scribe, broker or huckster. Despite the corruption of the city, Lymington believed that as long as country people existed, they could be used to freshen the breeding pool within cities and civilization could continue. But inevitably, cities would gain economic dominance over the countryside and rip more and more resources out of it, including the people who worked the land who would move to the cities to get a better quality of life. To Lymington, the loss of country people in this way spells the end of civilization. First, the soil is exhausted of its human stock and then of its own life-giving qualities. He talks through the fall of the Roman Empire to illustrate that when urban capitalism attacks those working the soil, all that will be left are corrupted, parasitic urban people, and the town will give way to the desert. He thinks that, as happened in Rome, capitalism will destroy both the blood and the soil of the country, and without the country, the city will starve. He then says that the remains of civilizations that have become corrupted and fallen in this way are visible in certain parts of the world because he was a very lovely man. The debased savage and the cannibal are not simply laggards in the disposed race of evolution, but the relics of people who have taken the wrong turning earlier than ourselves. So he's saying we must remain pure and uncorrupted in both a moral and eugenic sense. He thinks city people are a crime against nature, whereas farmers, the people still on the land, are part of nature. They're sustained by the soil, just as with the trees and the birds. And it's this relationship with nature he believes gives you natural people. In an earlier book, Famine in England, he describes city dwellers as subhuman scum, but here he defends farmers. The farmer knows full well the importance of environment, and he does not belittle it. This is because farmers live in equilibrium with their surroundings. They understand the trees and the birds, and they know how to grow crops. In other words, country people are adapted to their environment. Human beings become adapted through centuries of breeding to the necessities of their own soil, and while there may be no English or Aryan race, there is an English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish type adapted with remarkable success. Moreover, these types can interbreed with success. So in this view, city people divorced from the soil are not a type, they're a corruption of what a healthy person should be. But Lymington's main objective to the cities is the influence of money. He really hates finance capitalism, which he sees to trade on the fluctuations of markets and therefore on instability, which he sees as economic cannibalism. The finance industry, the exchange bankers and the stock exchange grow rich on the ups and downs of trade, but productive industry grows rich upon stable markets, a constant price level and the absence of violent economic fluctuations. And he thinks money power makes democracy a sham. Democracy today is virtually a fiction. The real rulers are small, often unknown groups of men who control nearly all the means of affecting political issues. So, to stem the corruption of our bodies and minds driven by an industrial, urban, consumerist lifestyle, Lymington wanted to re-establish the bond between blood and soil he believed to have been broken, and he was going to do that by re-establishing feudalism. We can recreate character and rediscover English values from the soil and the seas which formed us. Merry England is not a nostalgic myth, but a radiant possibility. But that means that in his vision, there is no place for all of the people who currently live in cities. Those people will have to be disposed of somehow. It is my belief that the optimum population of this country should not exceed 40 million if there is going to be breathing space and living room. 40 million, I think, is a high number that he's chosen to avoid critique. Organic agriculture in this country couldn't sustain 40 million people without imports because we don't have enough land. But the numbers aren't really relevant. He says what he means. In time, I do not believe that the vast aggregations of human dwellings, now miscalled cities, will be necessary. And he was writing at a time when there was an active debate about what we should do with the land and British society more generally after the war. So he sets out his vision for a post-war Britain, which predictably involves reasserting social hierarchies. Kingship, which is the apex of sound civilization, has been shuttered from the people. They have no protector or guide unless the aristocrat is present in every sphere. People often ask me to discuss King Charles's interest in organic ideology, and it's for the same reasons the ideology emerged. It's a hierarchical ideology that was used to justify the aristocracy, but in doing so it also justifies the king. So between the king and the people, it is the lords, the aristocracy, who are the missing link in the old feudal social hierarchy. He defines aristocrat in its literal sense, which he seems to believe is accurate. Aristocracy denotes the effective influence of the best. And he seems to genuinely believe that the lords who make up the aristocracy will be the greatest leaders and strongest men. Good blood will always find status. If we fail to protect those with innate superiority, integrity, and the power of self-giving, there can be no future for democracy. The use of the word democracy is a little confusing here, but this was published during the war with Germany. I think he's just covering his tracks. In comparison with the capitalists of the city, Lymington believed the aristocracy were incorruptible. They're not interested in gathering wealth, which would make a person greedy. They're interested in good leadership and spending their wealth wisely. Leadership, knowledge of character, unbiased and unbuyable judgment are the priceless assets of any civilization. History shows that these qualities are mainly connected with an aristocracy based on land. Lymington proposes the establishment of what he calls a national council, a council of 7 to 12 men chosen from the unelected House of Lords, who will then, in turn, elect their own successors. He says the men on the national council should be able to choose who is in charge of the War Agricultural Executive Committees after the war. These men would therefore be able to appoint people to oversee agriculture in Britain and make sure that land was being managed in a way that they wanted. And of course, those people would be aristocrats. Some 2/3 of England is held by landowners, as distinct from owner-occupiers, and it is mainly among the best of these that we must look for the restoration of leadership and an aristocratic conception of responsibility. The men on the National Council would be empowered to dispossess any farmers they considered to not be of sound values, and therefore they could purge any capitalistic attitudes from the land. And Lymington says that anyone who gets thrown off their land shouldn't get any compensation. Under these circumstances, those unfitted for land ownership would either be removed from the land or else have to learn to do their work. And he explains what this would mean in practice. It might also be possible to test on a wide scale the theories and practice of the leaders in the biodynamic school, with their immense reverence for the whole workings of nature. Biodynamic is the pre-war term for organic. He's suggesting here that reasserting aristocratic control of land would allow Britain to go organic. That sounds inoffensive, but we've seen what he thinks about cities and the people in them. He's suggesting giving unelected aristocrats oversight of land and therefore control of the food supply. And with that power, they could impose agricultural methods that would reduce the food supply. This is a plan to return Britain to a natural society. It's a blueprint for a genocide against city people, a nature-friendly genocide. In this vision, the cities are removed from the picture and then there is a perfect, orderly hierarchy on the land. You have the king at the top, the National Council of Lords beneath. They choose the lords who will run the agricultural executive committees, and then those lords will choose men of good stock with good wives to be their tenants, and the tenants will choose their labourers. Lymington criticised German and Italian fascism for being inconsistent. They wanted permanent peasant revival, as he did, but alongside Americanised mass production. Instead, he suggests that only aristocrats should come into contact with money to shield the rest of the population from its corrupting influence. He suggests that aristocrats could sell crops on behalf of their tenants and buy machinery for them. And this would also stop the tenants from becoming too independent or enterprising. Payments of rent in kind might have a definite place in the assurance of sound husbandry. Payments could be made for in the type of produce or crop which improves the land: wool, bacon, beef, dried lucerne, peas, beans and other legumes. And along similar lines, he doesn't want the people to be educated. There's no reason for that. They will never make decisions. He thinks girls should be trained to become good mothers and boys should work in the garden and become farmhands. All this means Lymington was very keen on nature. You need nature to have a natural environment that will produce the natural people that he wanted to see. And he says lots of things that sound very familiar today. We require woods and trees in soil ecology for exactly the same reason as we require them on the human side for the balanced life of the community. We need woods for shelter. We need woods even in England on many small slopes to prevent erosion. We require them to harbour the necessary amount of bird life, and above all, we require them to give balance to the soil. Hedgerows are useful for draining, for shelter of animals, and finally for the fact that leaves and bushes in the hedgerows provide a tonic variation in the diet for the stock grazing in the fields. This is because he sees people as ecological. People are not supposed to be in the city, they're part of nature, so human problems should be treated as such. The problem is not industrial, but agricultural and ecological. Soil and water, crops and timber are the measure for living space. Upon these must be based the harmony of breeds and types, custom and language, religion and tradition. This is very important. He doesn't want a wilderness. His end goal are the people that a natural environment will create. Reclaimable deer forests would probably go into improved sheep grazing. Thus, once again, the sheepfank and the cattle shirlings would appear in the hills. And again, this manifests in a rhetoric that we are very familiar with today. Civilization can only survive when it is in harmony with nature. Now we are faced with the possibility of self-destruction, which is almost masochistic because we have chosen to make war on nature. So we have seen how fascist blood and soil ideology and a belief in racial and social hierarchies within society lead to a defence of nature. But to Lymington, it's all the same thing. To him, the hierarchies visible in nature rising up out of the soil mean the aristocracy's position as rulers over men is just as natural as the cat who eats the bird who eats the worm. It all comes from the soil. As trees are necessary to bird life, a proper balance of birds in nature provides a balance against insect plagues. Also, insects themselves require a balance of one sort against another, probably. Though we know little yet, the same applies to fungi, mycelia, spores and bacteria of all sorts. As a class, the aristocracy want two things. The first thing they want is control. They are the ruling class. The second thing they want are natural hierarchies that justify their control. Lymington gets his control through the National Council, reasserting aristocratic authority over the use of the land. And he sees a natural hierarchy rising from the soil, including all of the plants and animals, and peasants who work the land and are part of the landscape, and then the aristocracy who rule over them. But this is built on a very ill-defined conception of soil. The hierarchy probably originates there, but we know little yet. It's beyond our understanding. That quote is very similar to one written by a modern-day member of the landowning class, who also writes about the importance of nature. A tree's life support system extends into a dark and invisible universe microbiologists and mycologists are only just beginning to fathom. And upon that dark and invisible universe in the soil, rewilding ideology is built in the same way Lymington built his. These two statements might seem like quite a tenuous link, but the thinking is the same. Hierarchies come from the soil, but in both instances they insist that the soil is beyond the understanding of science. Therefore, we must unquestionably trust the hierarchies. And as people are animals, the ascendancy of the aristocracy, in Lymington's day as now, then rises up from the soil through the trees and the bugs and the birds and the cows and the wolves to the people. Inevitably, I am overreaching here, and people will say, mate, scientists actually don't really understand soil, this has got nothing to do with fascism. But I doubt there is any area of human knowledge that we understand fully. This statement is meaningless, especially given the rest of the book that follows it talks incessantly about soil, which would suggest to me that we do know a fair bit about it. Although I think Lymington would rightly be horrified if he saw the rewilding movement, I think his organic movement laid the groundwork for it. They want the same things. Lymington wanted control through his National Council and natural hierarchy through his peasants. Isabella Tree gets control of the land by getting rid of her tenants and asserting personal control of her estate. You can't have peasants within a natural hierarchy now, peasants are too far gone. Instead, natural hierarchy is the obsession with wolves they have. But bear in mind, Lymington saw peasants as animals at the top of the food chain, which is what wolves are. In aristocratic ideology, peasants and wolves are the same thing, really. And just as Lymington had economic motivations being sparked to political action by Lloyd George's death duties on aristocratic estates that were crushing his social class out of existence, Isabella Tree's estate was in financial difficulty before rewilding allowed it to extort money from the taxpayer. Now, the government pays them to live in their big house and not produce anything. I think the main difference between Lymington and the rewilding people you get today is that while Lymington was a Nazi collaborationist who was trying to take us back to the Dark Ages, the rewilding people are trying to take us back to before the dawn of agriculture, which is a little bit more extreme. Do subscribe, we'll talk about this in excruciating detail in the future. We must be very careful of people who appeal to the health of soil. The post-war agricultural settlement that Lymington and Isabella Tree both oppose was designed to protect the soil with mixed farming, ensuring cropped land got manure and rested under grass lays. The soil was central to that idea. And farmers don't destroy their soil because that would put them out of business. Agriculture is soil management. We know that better than anyone else. But I think the influence of this ideology has been much more wide-reaching than the continuation of the organic movement or the reassertion of aristocratic values seen in rewilding. I've argued before that environmentalism is really just politics in the countryside. It deals with issues of social class, use of and access to resources, and there are different ways of approaching it. We've talked about capitalist environmentalism, a socialist environmentalism, the cheap food policy and national parks that we got after the war, but Lymington's ideas were a conservative environmentalism that lost the argument at the time and were temporarily banished into obscurity as an opposition to the cheap food policy, but with persistence it seems to have come back. The Industrial Revolution has come the whole cycle from whence it started. Whenever through specialisation an individual becomes a mere automaton, it is unhealthy for the nation. It was a retrograde step when we became mainly the merchant and workshop of the world. This is a very common way of looking at the climate crisis, but it is very dangerous. It's very common, and I think understandable on an emotional level, for people to think we're in this mess, the climate crisis is because of industrialisation. So if only we could go back to before industrialisation. But this has two flaws. Firstly, if we were to instate Lymington's vision and return to a pre-industrial society, it wouldn't fix the problem. The damage has already been done. It is very scary to me that people are falling back on this ultra-conservative view of human society in response to climate change, even if it's dressed up with all this cottagecore trad wife stuff we see, or discussed through memes of Ted Kaczynski. And secondly, we can't go back. Humanity only exists in the present, moving into the future. It's all very well wishing we'd never industrialise, but that doesn't help us now. I also think that Lymington's aggressive anti-capitalist sentiments allow these ultra-conservative ideas to appear left-wing. The Green Party, for example, are generally accepted to be a far-left party. But if any of you would like a fun internet rabbit hole for the evening, you will find that the Green Party's origins are not very left-wing, to say the least. I think if Lymington was to come back and see what these ideas have become, he would be horrified. The concept of natural capital, using carbon offsets essentially as a speculative financial market. Corporations engaging in greenwashing. He'd be disgusted. It does seem to me that the dominant strand of environmentalism today is a desire for nature that comes from Lymington's thoughts and the organisations he bankrolled, mixed with capitalism in a really unholy way. But that we see corporations and city people, the very things Lymington wanted to destroy, drawing on his rhetoric in the modern day, shows how powerful and influential his writings have been. The whole book is intended to explain methods which could first restore to no inconsiderable number of the English integrity of health for body and mind, in alliance with, rather than in opposition to, nature. Steve Reed, the Environment Minister, recently made a speech in which the central premise was that without nature we cannot have long-term food security. Without long-term food security we will get death, we will starve. That's what he's getting at here, although he's wording it quite delicately. Nature is an alternative to that. Alternative to death. It's the same idea. Now, I don't think Steve Reed is a fascist. He's a moron who is completely out of his depth. The parallels are uncanny, but it's not a coincidence. Lymington wasn't a fascist who was right about the nature side of things. The nature side of things is fascism. Appealing to nature, attacking the practices of scientific, progressive, independent farmers, demanding government subsidies for large landowners to restore wilderness on their estates. All of this is in service to the aristocratic class interest. That is where the word organic comes from. That's what the Soil Association was founded to do, to oppose the scientific, productive, independent farmers who were carrying out the cheap food policy and sustaining the urban working class. And I think the greatest irony of all this is that the organic ideology is a fundamentally anti-urban idea. It was devised to kill all of the city people by reducing the food supply. Yet the foot soldiers for the organic and rewilding movements today seem to be the urban middle class, who are campaigning to reduce the food supply that they themselves rely on. They attack farmers for destroying nature. I have been accused of denaturing my farm many times, whatever that means. But if farmers are singled out and subjected to punitive regulations and taxes and a culture war that we can't win, if we lose that battle and stop farming, suddenly the city will have been attacked. All of the friction around farming at the moment might seem like the city attacking the country, but it is the city attacking itself. It is the city people who will starve. If we were to go organic, globally, half of all people will not survive. In Britain, we rely on imports, so it would be even worse than that. And just scaling back agriculture, as lots of people want to do, would have a similar effect. On this note, in the video where we discussed the Bovaer methane-reducing cattle feed additive, people were concerned that Bill Gates is trying to control the food supply in order to reduce the population. But in response to this scientific methane-reducing cattle feed additive, people were saying that they would only eat natural, whole, organic foods from now on, which misses the point. Bill Gates might be a member of the elite trying to kill you by controlling and then reducing the food supply, but the organic people definitely are the elite trying to kill you by controlling and then reducing the food supply. That's what the word organic is for. I think another influence of this ideology is that people see climate and nature as united, or at least interchangeable. We see this in the Climate and Nature Bill currently going through Parliament, but this is not how it works. Climate is the chemical composition of the atmosphere. Nature is wildlife and biodiversity. They are distinct issues and often actually opposed to each other. This is actually how I discovered all this stuff. Growing up on a farm, I was always acutely aware of the problems that were being caused by climate change, so I did a lot of environmental work. But the people I met through doing that at school and university were always obsessed about land management and animals and restoring nature and all this stuff that we're used to hearing about. But the climate crisis is fundamentally an industrial problem. It's caused by industry releasing fossil fuels. Why is it that people obsess about land and agriculture, which if you put within the bigger picture is just not that relevant, really? I think it's because environmentalism, in Lymington's sense, is about nature and land. So when people become concerned about climate change, they turn to these established environmentalist ideas. But this is incredibly dangerous. Not only are these ideas actively designed to kill people in cities, but they're also often bad for the planet. The Soil Association has banned the use of Bovaer, for example. This would reduce methane emissions. These guys are not our friends. I am all about nature, but it is important to note that nature-friendly farming is often worse for the planet than large-scale industrialised monoculture factory farming, simply because it's less efficient. Not using sprays, for example, to comply with organic standards generally means cultivating more, which burns more fuel. Surely a more rational approach would be to sort the climate crisis out and then start thinking about nature. No restoration of nature can be secure unless the climate is stable, and most environmentalist thinking we see today seems to actively stand in the way of that. But it's because they are influenced by these ideas, which are about creating a natural society and not fighting climate change. To conclude, Lymington finishes the book with a very interesting quote, which I have lifted out of context. Though Hitler may be smashed, some part, not necessarily the best part, of his new order will linger as a sour victory over his own defeat. What he means here is that the working class might believe they can influence politics. But I think this statement is true in a different way. Point being, this book is political, and a lot of the rhetoric within it is familiar to us today because it forms the basis of the green ideology that we see now. These ideas were and are presented as an alternative to death, but they involve deaths, millions and millions of deaths. I hope you found that interesting and understandable. This was a very difficult episode to organise because it wasn't like Stapleton's book, which was a neat chain of thoughts. This was more like a blob of incoherent and loosely related ideas that I had to sort through and rearrange myself. And despite it all, in a strange way, I do relate to Lymington. He was writing at a time that his social class, the land-owning aristocracy, were being taxed out of existence by death duties on their estates, and they weren't very popular with the public. But Lymington was defending his social class's right to survive because he believed that they provided something that the nation needed, and that thing was leadership. Now, I'm not very sympathetic with that. I don't think we need aristocratic leadership. Death duties on estates allowed working families like my own to have a shot at buying and owning the land that they worked, and the revenue earned by the government paid for Lloyd George's welfare reforms. This was a good thing. But similarly, I am a member of a social class that is being taxed out of existence by inheritance tax on our farms, and we have been placed at the centre of a culture war, and we get lots of hate from certain sections of the media. My class is that of farmers, which is beneath and in opposition to Lymington's landowning class. I feel that we must fight for our existence because we provide something that the nation needs. But that thing isn't aristocratic leadership, it's food, which is something that we do still need. And therefore, I think we can make a slightly stronger argument today than Lymington did in his time. I'm also in the Farmers Weekly this week, if any of you are interested in that. I regret sending them the profile picture that I did, but every day is a school day. Join their Discord, follow the Instagram. If you appreciate what the channel is doing at the moment, consider supporting it through Buy Me a Coffee. This channel does not cover its own costs, but thank you to those of you who have supported it already. And most importantly, do let me know what you think in the comments below. A controversial one this week perhaps, but I see it as my civic duty to discuss these issues because no one else seems to be doing that, and I think they're important. So do subscribe and join me next week where I think we'll go to Africa and have a look at what happened when the aristocracy and British agrarian state socialism were both exported to the colonies after the war. I'll see you then.
As a direct result of the close partnership between farmer, machine maker and agricultural engineer, British farming is today more highly organized, more efficient and more mechanized than ever before in its history.